We are continuing our journey along the way to find out about history and how it came to be that we have Martin Luther King Jr. Day off. And why do we have it? It's because he's such an important man. So we have to find out, how is he important to our United States history? So we left off with reading Abraham Lincoln. We've heard about slavery, horrible time in the United States' history, fought the war. Abraham Lincoln ended up dying, but the slaves were freed. Now, we're going to jump ahead some years, and we're going to read about a woman named Rosa Parks. This is important because a lot of things, even though slaves were free, the South was still, it was a hard place to be if you were an African American. So we'll talk about that as we read. A picture book of Rosa Parks. So now we're moving ahead in history. Rosa Parks was born in Tuskegee, Alabama on February 4th, 1913. So it's about 50 years after Abraham Lincoln has been shot, okay? Her mother, Leona Edwards McCauley, was a school teacher. Rosa's father, James McCauley, was a carpenter and house builder. Rosa was the great-granddaughter of slaves. So she's not a slave, but her great-grandparents were. So that's how far, we aren't that far from history of having slavery now. Soon after Rosa was born, her family moved to Pine Level, Alabama. They lived on Rosa's grandparents' small farm where there were cows, chickens, fruit, and nut trees. In 1915, when Rosa was 2 years old, her brother Sylvester was born. Soon after that, their father left. He moved around to find work. While Rosa was growing up, she hardly saw him. As Rosa grew older, she worked on her grandparents' farm and in the nearby cotton fields. In the spring, she cleared weeds away. In the fall, she picked cotton. When Rosa was young, discrimination against African Americans was common. There were Jim Crow laws that kept black people and white people segregated. They were kept apart on streetcars and trains, at parks and drinking fountains, in churches, hotels, theaters, and restaurants. Even the United States Army was segregated. Now, I want you to see. So here we have, this is the drinking fountain that white people could use. And they used the term colored people for the African Americans. So they would put that colored up there. And I want you to compare the drinking fountains. Who has the nicer drinking fountain? Yeah, so it was the same thing for the rest of it. You know, the hotels, theaters, restaurants. Can you imagine not being able to play at the park with your friends if they were a different color than you were? But that's the way it was in the South. So that's what I'm saying. Slavery was over, but things still weren't great in the South. While Rosa lived in Pine Level, the Ku Klux Klan, a band of hate-filled whites, was active there. They wore white robes and covered their faces with pointed hoods. In southern cities and elsewhere in the United States, members of the Klan marched and helped elect political candidates who shared their hatred of African Americans, Roman Catholics, Jews, and foreigners. They burned crosses and beat, tortured, and killed many African Americans. Rosa's grandfather, Sylvester Edwards, carried a shotgun to protect his family from the Klan. Can you imagine hating people just because they're a different religion than you are or a different color than you are? We know now that's not okay. But this went on, and this is kind of the bad part of our United States history. And now, it wasn't always just the South either. So that's where we need to have these conversations and make sure we talk about this so that we know this is wrong. Rosa's mother taught Rosa to read. Then, when Rosa was 6 years old, she started first grade in an old one-room school for African American children. The school was open just 5 months a year. The new brick school building for white children was open 9 months a year. So right there, compare the education that African Americans are getting and white students are getting. The white students are going to school 4 more months. So they're getting that much more learning, and they're going to school in a really nice building. Think of how that would feel compared to being an African American, and you don't go to school as much. You're not learning as much. It was a way to keep people so that they didn't learn as much, which is not okay. You know how Mrs. Robinson wants you to learn. School for Black children in Pine Level stopped after 6th grade. So in 1924, Rosa continued her studies in Montgomery, Alabama. She had to leave school in 1929 because of family illness. She took care of her sick grandmother, and then she cared for her mother, who was sick too. Rosa finished high school in 1933. In 1931, Rosa met Raymond Parks, a barber and a man active in the struggle for the rights of African Americans. Rosa was proud that he spoke up for what was right. Rosa and Raymond were married in December 1932 in her mother's home in Pine Level. In the early 1940s, Rosa joined the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an organization that worked to end the unfair treatment of African Americans and others. So how he said, slavery's done, but things are really unfair in the United States right now for her. Raymond Parks had been a member for many years. Soon after Rosa joined, she was elected secretary of the Montgomery branch of the association. Buses in Montgomery were a daily reminder that the city was segregated. African Americans were allowed only to sit in the back. On some buses, they entered through the front door, paid the fare, and were told to leave the bus and go back in again through the back door. Sometimes before they could get on again, the driver drove away. So here, they've paid their fare. They should be allowed to ride. But they don't let them. They drive away, even though they've paid. They don't even give them time to get on. And then they're forced to sit at the back of the bus. One day in 1943, Rosa got on the front of a crowded bus and paid the fare. The driver, James Blake, told her to get off and use the back door. Rosa told him she was already on the bus. She didn't see the need to get off, and besides that, she didn't think she could enter through the back door. It was blocked by the many people standing there. But Rosa got off. She didn't get on again. She waited for the next bus. "12 years later, on Thursday, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks met James Blake again. Rosa was coming home from her work as a tailor's assistant at a Montgomery department store. She got on the Cleveland Avenue bus and took a seat in the middle section. African Americans were allowed to sit in the back and in the middle section too, as long as no white passenger was kept standing. At the next stop, some white passengers got on, and because the bus was crowded, moved to the middle section where Rosa was sitting. The driver told the 4 African American passengers in Rosa's row to get up. 3 of them did, but not Rosa Parks. She had paid the same fare as the white passengers. She knew it was the law in Montgomery that she give up her seat, but she also knew the law was unfair. James Blake called the police, and Rosa Parks was arrested. Can you imagine? Just because she was sitting in her seat and she wouldn't give it up to a white person. On Monday, December 5th, Rosa went to the local court and was found guilty of breaking the segregation laws. She was fined $10 plus court costs. Rosa and her lawyers appealed to a higher court. Beginning on December 5th, to protest the arrest of Rosa Parks, African Americans in Montgomery refused to ride on public buses. They found other ways to get to work. Many walked, some as far as 12 miles. So now with this bus boycott, they're saying, you aren't going to treat us fairly. We're not going to ride the buses. African Americans gave a lot of business to the buses. So let's see what happens. The bus boycott was led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the new minister at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. On Monday evening, December 5th, he spoke to a large crowd. He explained the reason for the boycott. There comes a time, he said, that people get tired. We are here this evening to say to those who have mistreated us so long that we are tired. Tired of being segregated and humiliated. Tired of being kicked about by the brutal feet of oppression. He's saying these laws are not fair and we're tired of it. The boycott lasted more than a year. During that time, almost no African Americans rode a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and many others were arrested. Homes of boycott leaders were bombed. On November 13th, 1956, the United States Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was against the law. So they said, you can't do that anymore. It's not legal to say you have to segregate on buses. On December 21st, after the court order reached Montgomery, the boycott ended. News reporters came to talk to Rosa and to photograph her sitting on a bus again. It took a year to change a law that we know is wrong. For some people, the civil rights movement in the United States, which was the fight for the rights of all people to be treated as equals, began with the arrest of Rosa Parks. For many others, it began 1 year earlier. In May 1954, the Supreme Court had ruled that separate schools for blacks and whites was unequal and against the law. They finally said, there's no reason you need a black school and a white school. Everybody should be treated the same. Everybody should be going to school and learning the same things. But while schools and buses in the United States could no longer be segregated, there was still much discrimination against African Americans. Rosa Parks went to many demonstrations and civil rights marches. Rosa Parks received threatening telephone calls. Her family worried about her safety. In 1957, Rosa and Raymond Parks left Montgomery with Rosa's mother and moved to Detroit, Michigan, where Rosa's brother Sylvester lived. In 1965, Rosa began working in the Detroit office of John Connors, a member of the United States House of Representatives. She did a lot of good work in that office, including helping poor people find homes. She retired in 1988. The late 1970s were difficult years for Rosa Parks. In 1977, after a long illness, her husband died. Her brother died a short while later, and in 1979, Rosa's mother died too. So she had a lot of people who passed away in the 70s. That would have been hard. In 1987, Rosa founded the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development to give young people hope and to help them complete their education. Rosa Parks has been called the mother of the civil rights movement. The movement brought many needed changes in the United States. It is now against the law for Americans to discriminate against people because of their race, color, religion, or nationality, at work or in restaurants, hotels, and other public places. The right of every citizen to vote is protected. Rosa Parks has received many honors, among them the Springer Medal, the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Peace Prize, the Eleanor Roosevelt Woman of Courage Award, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Cleveland Avenue in Montgomery was named Rosa Parks Boulevard. But perhaps the greatest reward for Rosa Parks is seeing people of all races on buses and in public schools and other places being treated fairly and with the respect all people deserve. So next, we'll read the story about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself.